I'm here.
Councilmember Barry. Councilmember Clay. Here. Councilmember Robinson.
Here.
Councilmember Siemens.
Here.
Councilmember Sniffer. Councilmember Wright.
Here. I didn't make it.
Yes, you did. There was a little mouse that called.
Thank you.
Are there any council comments? Councilmember Wright and Councilmember Clay.
Two local issues. One is there have been a large number of signs, political signs, stolen in my ward or taken away. Mainly, to my knowledge, only Barack Obama signs. I've asked the police chief to look into this and have the officers keep an eye out for it. And they
Are there any other signs in town?
Good point. Well, there are signs supporting civil marriage and Tacoma Park Folk Festival signs, both of which are in my yard and were untouched, but the Obama sign was removed. That's the second time in my yard. One of my constituents, I think, has had a sign stolen or removed 4 or 5 times, an Obama sign. So I would just remind people, if they see anyone doing anything suspicious with signs, to please report it right away. And also remind anyone who's doing this, it's more than a petty crime. It's probably trespassing, could be considered voter intimidation. I think we should just let people have their free speech and make their decisions and not vandalize signs. The second thing is, last week I spoke about a meeting we're having with the chief. Originally it was going to be scheduled for tomorrow. It actually will be on the 23rd. That's a meeting with all of the Ward 1 citizen associations presidents. I've invited Councilmember Robinson as well as Bruce Moyer from the WACO Citizen Association. And we're going to discuss the plan to deal with proactively preventing crime as the daylight hours get shorter, and what the Citizens Association and Safe Tacoma can do to help out with that. Two issues more outside of Tacoma Park that affect Tacoma Park that I wanted to comment on. First is, I would ask that the mayor and my council colleagues considering putting 2 items on the agenda in the coming weeks, and those would be items to discuss 2 ballot initiatives or referendum that are going to be on the ballot November 4th. One has to do with slots, and the other has to do with equal rights or non-discrimination against transgendered individuals. So first I would just say quickly on the slots, I know where I stand on this, but I think we should have a healthy debate about it. My personal opinion is that for Maryland, slots do not make sense. I think people look at it as a silver bullet to solve the budget crisis. We won't be getting money right away. It'll be a couple years before we get money from slots. The costs of the social services that we would need to deal with, all the negative aspects of slots having to do with increased crime, addictive gambling, are going to far outweigh the costs associated. The costs will far outweigh the revenue we get from slots. And I think we need to say no to slots and push back on the legislature and the governor to say we want real solutions for our economy, real solutions for our budget crisis, and some real leadership around developing an economy that's based on green jobs, biotech, information technology, high-paying good jobs, as opposed to a quick fix that's really not a fix at all. And then, to me, the transgender issue is pretty straightforward. People should have equal rights regardless of their sexual orientation and their choices about transgender or what gender they're pursuing or want to be. But I think both of those should be items that we discuss, and then I don't think it'll take a lot of time to have the discussion and have a resolution passed one way or the other.
Councilmember Clay.
Thank you. One item tonight. The intersection at Ethan Allen and Elm has been the site over the last couple of weeks of folks in vehicles driving up over the, whatever you want to call them, chicanes, chevrons, bump outs, landscaped bump outs. And the vehicles are going up over the curb and hitting the rocks and the trees and the landscaping that our gardener helps to put in and that the residents there are maintaining. And I actually, hopefully, I will have some car parts for you later. that are the parts that were left behind by the last large truck that careened around the corner, over the rocks, over the speed bumps, backwards through the Elm Auburn Circle, all while yelling out the window as he went along. It was all witnessed by our local 13-year-olds. So it's sort of part of the ongoing distress in Ward 2 around traffic issues, and I think actually a lot of folks in Ward 6 suffer this as well. And I think there has to be some better solution there. I think one of the reasons that Elm and Lincoln get so much of the brunt of it is because we've essentially made it illegal to turn that's the first legal place you can turn essentially from East-West Highway to cut over to Carroll or University if you're not going to go up New Hampshire Avenue. And it constantly amazes me how people feel like they have the right to drive as fast as they want to on their streets, and we're essentially, as a neighborhood, in their way. And that really is literally the way we get treated, and it's the way the residents feel. And we have that problem not only on Elm, but we have the problem on Flower, and I know other people have the problem as well. But those are kind of particularly narrow areas. The police did come out and make a report. The police officer wrote back to me today and wanted to note that he felt that Elm was just too narrow there for two cars to pass. But, you know, the fact of the matter is, though, while I appreciate his analysis, the bump outs don't go out any farther than a car that's parked there would be, and cars have the right to park along there. So, you know, I'm not buying that. And the city planning department and the city engineers designed that area there to be at that width after we had to do the street renewal and we had to add the ADA accessible sidewalk. And it was the sidewalk that determined what the width of the street was, not the circle or the bump outs or any of that. The bump outs are really only there to protect the rear end of the cars that would be slammed into if the bump outs weren't there to deflect them before they came around the corner. So I know I've been asking this for over a year, but what I would really like is a meeting with the city manager, someone from the planning department. I don't care if it's the planning director or if it's our planner, Alana Blanchard, who did a lot of the planning, and the public works director, to go back out and talk about if there are any enhancements or modifications that we can make to that to make it work. You know, the suggestion from the police department, which was CC'd to the public works director, was that we would paint more lines. But before we go out there with a can of paint or a sign or anything else, I'd rather we got together and problem solve this together.
Councilmember Robinson.
You pick. Thank you for overriding the mayor.
We'll fix that.
Two quick things. I just would like to call the people's attention that October 14th is the last day to register for this upcoming election, and it's important that people do register and vote, especially this year. I think it's a very important election. And secondly, and it's kind of related to Councilmember Clay's comments, but the planning department is testing some traffic calming measures at the intersection of Maple Avenue and Sligo Creek Parkway, and I just want to make sure that they are considering the traffic restrictions that the county is planning on implementing at that same intersection in the coming months. So if you pass that along, I appreciate it. That's all.
I met with somebody who was concerned with the transgender referendum item also, and have some words. So, Councilmember Wright, maybe we can get together and craft the first ordinance together, something like that. Because I also think it's a no-brainer. In my ward in Pinecrest, there have been talks of traffic calming for a while, and there's one intersection, one street chunk called Kansas, between Allegheny and Cockerell, which is a steep hill. And when it rains or snows, it gets slick, and cars tend to careen down and crash into the sidewalk or the house at the bottom. And so to resolve that, there was a suggestion that that street turn one way going uphill. And there's been a lot of consternation about that. And after some conversations, I finally kind of got it, that it's about two things. It's about traffic calming and safety of somebody's house. And so I'm trying to peel that apart. I'm ready to go with you, Councilmember Clay, to meet with engineer, other staff, to figure out how to pull those things apart, because it seems to me that on Elm there at between East-West, or between East-West and Larch, no, Boyd, no, wherever the circle is, Lincoln, thank you. You have similar issues, so maybe it's a matter of looking at those two issues separately, and figuring out what makes sense when they're both together, both traffic calming and safety. Pinecrest Neighborhood Association has a meeting on Wednesday night at 7:30. I encourage all you Pinecresters to attend. It'll be an election and a time to sign up for Pinecrest Neighborhood Association. The Committee on the Environment has a meeting tomorrow night where I'm going to go as a staff liaison of sorts, and we're going to have a good brainstorming session about how they can bring things back to us in a concise and clear manner so that we can engage our own staff, and how they can carry on and beef up their committee and maybe have a democratic change, which sounds like they're ready for. It sounds like Catherine's ready to get a life of her own beyond Committee on the Environment. So I'm glad to have had that little conversation, and I appreciate both Councilmember Siemens and Mayor Williams, your conversations with Catherine as well on that note. I think that's it. Thank you.
I just got one or two things to note. Remind everybody that the Folk Festival is this coming Sunday, September 14th from 11 to 6 at Tacoma Park Middle School. And just to remind anybody who might have been interested about the possibility of a discussion at the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission that was originally thought to be September 18th for possible discussion on mandatory referral on Montgomery College, that is not the case, and that will be extending on out into the next month or two with kind of an open-ended question about whether it will end up going to mandatory referral. So if anybody was contemplating going to a potential planning board meeting on the 18th, that is not the case. So if there are no other council comments?
Bruce?
Yes?
I just had one quick question for Suzanne. Where are we on installation of the speed cameras? Because Councilmember Clay's comments remind me of that driving down in Councilmember Barry's ward recently on New Hampshire Avenue. Two sites where we were going to test out speed cameras. I'm anxious to sort of see when that's going to happen, because I think there's other places in the city where they might be quite useful.
Actually don't know. I'm sorry. I'll have to find out.
Okay, great.
Okay, then the next item is adoption of minutes for July 14th. Somebody like to move their adoption?
Move them.
Second.
Moved by Councilmember Siemens, seconded by Councilmember Wright. Are there any comments?
I've sent my corrections to the city clerk.
Okay, all those in favor of adoption of the minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. Next item, I'll just provide a very brief agenda scheduling update, just to remind folks that next Monday, the 15th, we're going to have a work session discussion, continuing our discussion on council priorities, and we're also going to have a discussion about establishing a grants program for distributing grants to organizations. And on the following Monday, the 22nd, that's essentially going to be Public Safety Night. And a reminder that the last Monday of the month, September 29th, we will not be meeting at all since Rosh Hashanah begins at sundown. Bruce? Yes.
Can I just remind us that we need to try and get the Mansonization issue onto the agenda sometime in the fall, probably October at this point, but I know that's an issue we want to look at soon before it gets to the point where people are already making their houses into massive mansions.
And as we heard about today, there are a few more of those in the pipeline. Now it's time for public comment period for anybody who wishes to make any comments to us about anything that's not on the regular meeting agenda tonight, which is the consent agenda. So therefore, anybody who wants to talk about anything, and if you please keep your comments to 3 minutes, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Rosalind Grigsby. I'm Executive Director of the Old Tacoma Business Association. Joining me tonight is Elizabeth Buenkama. She is the Main Street Tacoma Promotions Committee Chair, and also probably familiar to some of you as the manager of Now and Then. And we're really here to keep you up to date on some of the things we have happening. And Elizabeth has some show and tell.
It's always fun. As you know, the Street Festival is coming up Sunday, October 5th. A couple of the other visible items that we have participated in recently, most of you probably know that Gables Residential is going to be open for residents later this month. It's on Blair Road between Piney Branch and Carroll. And working in conjunction with the folks at Gables, what we did was create this Main Street Old Tacoma tote bag along with their Gables Residential logo for all of the new residents. So in the bag, what they get is also created just for them, this Old Tacoma baseball hat, compliments of House of Musical Traditions, Capitol Acoustics CD, the favorite What Happens in Tacoma Park Gets Debated in Tacoma Park bumper sticker, and the Business Survival Guide, plus some information from Historic Tacoma and Historic DC. So there's 145 units, and each person who moves in will get this. And again, it's just something to introduce them to Tacoma Park, Tacoma DC, what a wonderful community we are, and how much we're pleased to have them now as our neighbors. The other thing that is actually literally hot off the press today is what I hope will be the first annual Old Tacoma calendar. And this is part of what we've been trying to do this year with promotions, which is to really reinforce shopping local, support your local businesses, support your community, keep it in Tacoma Park as much as possible. Otherwise, we lose the beautiful community that we have here. I did bring extras for all of you this evening. You will be the first to have these. And perhaps you might recognize the cover model of this year's calendar. Please. There's actually enough for everyone. No. So that's just some of the things that we've been up to this year. And again, thank you all so much for your continued support of OTBA and the Main Street program. Thank you.
That first packet sounds wonderful. I'm not sure I need another copy of the directory, but I think the other items in there are great items.
Fun, yeah. Thank you.
And who is this?
Rakish gentleman? I believe he's our mayor.
Sorry about that. I believe he's the mayor of Main Street.
Yes.
I hope the cable TV people can get this so everyone at home can see this picture.
Zoom in.
We will have prints of everybody in the calendar up on the third floor, and Friday the 19th will be the opening, the gallery reception for the calendar. And so we'll get that information out to everybody.
Great.
They'll be for sale on our MainStreetTacoma.org website, at the Folk Festival, the Street Festival, the stores who have participated in the calendar, and at the reception as well.
Will interested residents be able to buy a poster size copy of the picture?
We can work out an arrangement with the photographer for that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Is there any other public comment? Okay, then we'll move on to the city manager's comments. And in this case, the deputy city manager's comments.
Yes, the city manager is on vacation this week. She had to wait an extra day till Hannah passed so she could go to North Carolina, where she was vacationing with her husband. I got a couple items about Tropical Storm Hannah, which came through on Saturday. Of course, Tacoma Park was very fortunate not to be hit like parts of Virginia were. And the couple things that happened were handily taken care of by Public Works and the Police Department. There was some power outages near Poplar where a tree went down, and also behind Roanoke where some lines were taken down. Sligo Creek Parkway was closed early, kind of preemptorily, for flooding, but didn't flood, as far as I understand, so that's good. All of the folks reported doing well, so I thought that was a good thing for Tacoma Park. I wanted to mention a little bit about Sligo Creek Parkway being closed. This is something that's the work that's being done by WSSC that we've been briefed on earlier. Despite that discussion, it has caught a number of people by surprise. We'll try and keep some information posted about that. It does look like the section between Maple and New Hampshire in general will be closed until January. So people need to take that into their plans. There, there is opportunity for local traffic to get in and out, but it's very difficult.
When does
And
that start?
It started. In fact, I got caught in it today trying to get to the dentist on Sligo Creek Parkway. So
Probably going to cause some havoc with the traffic survey then.
yes, I think it's a problem. I have discussed that. I wanted to follow up a little bit on Councilmember Wright's comment on the Obama signs being taken. Seems like I've had a lot of discussion about signs in the last few days. The two different things that I'd like people to be aware of is that when temporary signs are on private property, you don't touch them. They're the people's, they're the owner's property, and you leave them. However, public property, the rights of way between the sidewalk and the curb, public parks are not places for signs. So don't put them on the power poles. Don't put them on the different kinds of boxes on trees. Today I was looking out of my window, and a pickup truck pulled up and stapled two big posters on a large tree across the street from us, from the building, and I went out and yelled at him. But but it does. And when I said, we don't put posters up in the right-of-way here, he said, well, it's just a problem because younger people have been putting signs up everywhere, and I didn't quite get the point. But what it did mean was that the more you see signs, the more people think it's okay to put up signs. Please help take them down where they're not appropriate. And of course, we have our Sick of Signs Week coming up in about 2 weeks.
I think September 27th
That's
is the end of the week.
And that will be a nice contest for people to actually take down signs, bring them into this building. We'll give prizes for people who collect the most, collect the brightest, collect the worst, whatever. We'll come up with some nice categories for folks and end up with an ice cream social. So there's information on the website and in the newsletter about those, and we strongly urge people to participate. That's it.
Any questions? Yeah.
When I was a kid, I worked in Costa Mesa, California as a security guard at South Coast Plaza. And Costa Mesa had a law against putting flyers on cars or essentially anywhere. And but where it affected us was people would come by and flyer the windshields. And we would call the police, and they would actually fine them for the cleanup costs of the flyers. So if we could catch the flyer person, we'd tell them, hey, you either go pull them off all the windows, or we call the police and they fine you. And it really reduced the amount of flyers, but also of litter that we had in the city. And can we do something like that where you can actually, like the 1-800-GOT-JUNK that gets stapled to the front of the community center sign out here and those kinds of things?
I'll check into the different options that we have, but we've been pursuing many different ways of getting to the people who are behind the signs. It's easy to not like the signs that say, money for your unwanted car or whatever. What's a little bit tougher is when it's an organization that you like that has the signs up, or it's a lost kitten or whatever. We all need to be conscientious that these don't go into the public space. And we are trying to find a variety of ways to discourage them. So thank you, Councilmember. I wanted to go back on the, to reinforce, though, Councilmember Wright's comments on, for example, removal of Obama signs or any other political signs. It is illegal to do that. It's un-American to do it. And we do urge people to report that. That's something we want to take care of right away.
I guess based on this discussion, I also want to make sure that I'm correct in my recollection, and if I am, remind people that there are certain types of signs that are allowed in the public right-of-way, and they're supposed to be things like I'm having a yard sale or something like that. They're kind of personal signs, and they have to go up with the date they went up, and they have to be removed within a certain amount of time. But I think there are actually a few signs that are legal for a limited period of time. So if people are out there pulling down the signs, there might be a few. No. There are certain parameters for the signs and the duration that are legal, unless we change the law. But that's the way it was.
We follow the county law on those, so I'll double check.
Okay. If there's nothing else, we'll move to the next item on the agenda, which is an update on FiOS availability in the city. And with us this evening, well, I guess Lonnie's going to introduce her.
I'm here. I might as well do something.
Sure.
Good evening, and as Bruce, as the mayor indicated, we have with us representing Verizon, Brianna Gowing, who's the Assistant Vice President of External Affairs for Verizon, and I'll let her tell us what she has to tell us about FiOS in Tacoma Park.
Good evening. I'm Brianna Gowing, representing Verizon. Thank you very much for having me tonight, Mayor Williams and council members. I'm delighted to give you all an update on our Verizon's FiOS work in the city, and I'm sure you've all noticed all the trucks around town. Last year, Verizon spent almost $2 million a day bringing to Maryland what USA Today called the most advanced network on the planet. And with fiber optic cable added to our network, Verizon is able to offer Tacoma Park residents its award-winning FiOS service. Having fiber optics enables us to offer real cable TV competition and screaming fast internet access. We're now more than halfway through the project in Tacoma Park, so Verizon FiOS service is now available to about 2,000 homes. We're working hard to bring the service to the rest of the homes in town, and we're also in active negotiations with some of the apartment complexes to wire those apartments or high-rises. Before the end of the year, we expect to have all the construction and splicing work done in Tacoma Park. Then FiOS will be available to all single-family homes and most townhouse developments. Once FiOS is available at someone's house, Verizon does notify those customers with an overnight letter which has the current prices and any promotions. Currently, there's a 1-year free multi-room DVR or digital video recorder promotion. I brought in some brochures about the different packages that we offer, but the information is also available at verizon.com/FiOS. It's easy for interested residents to plug in their phone number and see if FiOS is available at their house. They can do it today, or they can do it in a couple of months if they're interested in the service. They can order the service online, and generally the best prices and deals are online, so I would suggest trying that first. You can also call us. While we know that a lot of people are interested in having the latest technology, some people just like things the way they are. For those folks, nothing changes. Verizon will continue to offer its plain old telephone service, or what we call POTS, over its copper lines, and DSL high-speed internet access service is available in many areas. So we do appreciate everyone's patience as we try and add more fiber to your life, and so I welcome any questions you have. Thank you.
Can you give a little definition of screaming fast?
Well, the slowest service we offer now is 10 megabits per second down and 2 up. So I think we're the only ones who offer such a fast speed going back out, like if you're sending out an email attachment or something.
And how does that relate to other technologies currently available?
With our, for instance, I'll compare it to DSL. DSL, the fastest you could get if you were pretty close to one of our offices is 3 megabits per second. And so 10.2 is very fast. And then the next up, you can get like a 52, which is would be great if you worked from home and were a webmaster and had several computers. I mean, you probably wouldn't even notice any kind of slowdown. It's very fast.
Any questions?
Will it be going to all homes in Tacoma Park?
Yes, all single-family homes. And then normally what we have to do is work with a property owner if there's an apartment or condominiums. And so we have to negotiate a contract with them. So those are not automatically taken care of. But what I do is if anybody contacts me and says, I live in an apartment, I ask them to get me the property management information, and then I pass it on to the folks who negotiate those contracts.
Is there business service as well using FiOS?
There is business service available.
A business owner's eyes light up.
Can you give us an idea of pricing relative to, say, DSL or?
Well, right now, the best deal is usually in a bundle. So if you get the service, which is the 10 megabits per second, 10 down, 2 up, it's $104.99 a month. And that also includes unlimited local calling, long distance, 3 calling features, and the cable TV service, which is won a lot of awards and is digital, crystal clear. And then if you wanted the faster service, I believe that's $114.99 a month. So you can order the services individually, but that's usually the best offer is a bundle. And then the set-top boxes are separate, depending on how many TVs you have and whether you want high def or.
Is there a, let's see, does the FiOS work the same way as cable? That is, if everybody in your neighborhood gets on it? No. Okay.
No. We do not have a shared network kind of platform. We have a direct connection with you, the way we do now with a phone. So there isn't that shared bandwidth. So we have no limits now on how much you can download. There's no problem with peer-to-peer. There's nothing like that.
And does, if somebody's watching cable, does it affect phone or internet speeds?
No. It's different.
Different frequencies?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I just wanted to check, as we talked about last time you were here, Ritchie Avenue has had some, box problems, lack of lines, and the old lines are not working well, and so we've always had, in recent years, problems with somebody on the street having bad phone service because there are some bad lines, and there aren't enough lines for everybody to use. Are people going to have to upgrade to FiOS to get around that, or are you going to use the new capability to fix the basic problem that's been out there?
Well, I was going to say, if you can let me know or contact me, or Lonnie can contact me about somebody individual, we can have them look at that. But overall, we are putting fiber in because there are a lot of lines that are older, and copper just has a limited life. And this is so much better. Fiber was specifically built for large amounts of data, and it just is not affected by the weather like copper is.
Right.
It's just a better, more resilient service. So we hope they will take it because it's about the same price as the phone. Well, the same phone service is the same. So we hope they'll take it and it'll be better service. But if there's some individual problem, I'd be glad to have them look at it.
So somebody could just call and say they want to switch their phone over to FiOS, it would cost them the same, and they get better quality. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I would just ask you talk with the Victory Tower
Okay.
management company for Victory Tower. I can get that information to you if you email me.
Okay.
I know many of those residents would be interested in having this as an option.
Okay, I try to work it both ways. I'll give our guys the information, and at the same time say, call the property manager, and tell them, several people want it, and so that'll help, I think, with the negotiations. So I'll get that information from you.
Any other questions? Thanks for coming. We're glad to be able to have some new technology here that might make people's lives easier and either decrease costs or at least keep costs the same but get better service.
I think everybody likes competition. So
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. And next, we have a presentation from the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments on their draft National Capital Region Climate Report. And with us this evening, we have Executive Director David Robertson and Stuart Freudberg, and I'm going to say your title is Environmental Director. So, welcome, and are there some things that you want to tell us first? Do you want to do the presentation, because we'll need to move down there?
What I thought I'd do, Mr. Mayor, is just make a brief introduction to the presentation that Stuart will make, and then if you need to do some logistics issues, we're happy to
Okay, you might want to move a little closer to that microphone.
Okay. Really, I just want to do is put this in a context, because, again, particularly for the council, I know Mayor and the council have been active with our organization for some time, particularly, but for the folks that may be watching this evening, to put it a little bit into context, because really, this work has been underway for more than a year, and it really follows on an effort by the Council of Governments to really push the envelope a little bit and to have some stretch goals for the organization, the association, as well as for our member governments. What you're going to hear this evening is perhaps one of the most significant bodies of work that we have done in recent memory. And the only other experience perhaps in the last few years, and I know the mayor is familiar with this, is the issue of Homeland Security. An issue that really has transformed the work of this organization. Just as Homeland Security work in the attacks of 9/11 caused our organization to stretch and grow and to take on new roles and responsibilities, the presentation that you will hear from Stuart in just a moment, I think, has the potential to do the very same thing, but in a new area around climate change. When we look at the challenges that we face as a region, the commonality between Homeland Security and climate change is just about everyone understands that these are long-term challenges that are not likely to be addressed in a year or two, and that it's absolutely critical that we address these issues between multiple jurisdictions. And so, just as I think our region cannot be successful addressing climate change one community at a time, we need to work together regionally on issues of environmental protection and energy conservation. We have really found an opportunity, I think, through this work to really push the envelope. The other thing I would mention, again, just quickly, is that I have not seen an issue in recent years to capture the vision, the energy, and really the focus of our member officials. We're very proud of the work that we've done. It's been a year in the making, and this evening is really the kickoff of what we hope will be the next couple of weeks of very intense presentations to all of our jurisdictions. Normally we have reports and activities and we send them to our member governments, and we hope that there's a lot of engagement and discussion, but this is so important that we have scheduled time on your agenda this evening. Stuart and I were out in Fairfax County earlier today. We have Montgomery County tomorrow during the morning. We have Alexandria tomorrow evening, and so forth in all of our jurisdictions. Knowing a bit, working with the mayor and the council, I believe we will have a favorable reception this evening for this important work. But I would mention that these are stretch goals. We will be asking our member jurisdictions, our businesses, our residents to really not only change behaviors, but begin to look at some of the long-term responsibilities that they have as communities, as residences, and businesses. So I would like to ask you to give attention to Stuart Freudberg. I know you're going to come on down, I guess, so that you can see the slideshow, and then Stuart and I will be available for questions after that.
Okay, and if I can just clarify at this point that this is the draft report and that there's going to be an opportunity for comments about the draft.
Exactly.
And that anyone can make those comments?
Yes. It's on our website, and Stuart will touch on that, but any of the folks watching this evening, and certainly the collective opinion of the council would be most welcome.
Okay, thanks.
So the last slide actually has a very specific website.
Okay. I wanted to make sure that for anybody watching, they realize that they can have input, so as you're going through with the presentation, if they do have questions or comments, they know that they can...
But if you go to mwcog.org, on the front page you'll find a little picture of the climate change report, and you click there, and that'll take you to a comment page. Should also mention that there are a few extra hard copies of the report over there in that box by the door, and Mr. Mayor, we'd be happy to leave them if you would like. Leave them for your use if that would be helpful to you. Oh, and yes, we also brought 2 copies of our best practices report, which is a compilation of all the great things our members have done, including the City of Tacoma Park, to advance climate change initiatives. So as soon as the slides come up, David, I want to thank him for helping frame this, and he did actually cover our first couple of slides. This activity began a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, on our 50th anniversary, April 11, 2007, and Mayor Williams was part of our board action that launched this initiative, recognized the critical importance of dealing with climate change, and also recognized that it needed a kick at the local level. Local governments are the leaders in many, many areas, and while you can't solve everything, you can certainly do a lot. So here's the official presentation, and if we can bring up actually the second slide when you can. If you want to go into slideshow mode to make it a little bigger, if that's doable. Somewhere. There you go. Up one box. There you go. Slideshow. Up one. There. Try that. Also, they just click it, hopefully. Sort of. Oh, there we go. Ooh. Yeah. If you don't mind changing, that's fine. I should also mention that there's another member of the COG staff in your audience tonight, Aubin Maynard, who just came to hear the presentation. He's working on the restoration of the Anacostia, and even more important to this council, he's a constituent. And he's very new to us and very new to you, so he needs to find out what district he's in and who his official member of this council is. If you go to the next slide, it does list the actions that our board took on April 11th, 7 tasks, preparing a regional inventory of greenhouse gases, identifying best practices, you see that report, looking at impacts of climate change, both globally and locally, recommending goals, figuring out how to permanently position this initiative within the COG structure, take advocacy positions, and prepare a report. And we now have a draft. Go to the next slide. The committee was appointed by our board. It's 18 officials from around the region. Many were elected officials. Not all jurisdictions actually were represented in the way this committee was set up on sort of an ad hoc basis. Also, you'll see that it has a number of folks from the WMATA, Regional Transit Authority, the Board of Trade. We also have some state representation, both from Virginia and Maryland. Tad Aburn, actually, from the Maryland Department of the Environment, was really instrumental in helping us work through this. And Maryland just issued its own Climate Commission report, which, if you have not heard a presentation, I would urge you to invite the state folks to come. They have a very far-reaching effort as well, and very complementary to our work. The best practice, next slide, best practices guide. We did issue actually earlier this year, and our Institute for Regional Excellence class, Mr. Mayor, near and dear to your heart, helped us actually do the work to compile the data from our members, and it's a very good guide and shows the leadership of our region in taking this problem on. You can see a few highlights: purchase of renewable energy, energy efficiency programs, transit-oriented development, walkable communities, green space protection, green infrastructure programs, and everybody has a recycling program, and one day we'd like to show that 100% have everything up there, and not only just a few programs, but widespread. Next slide. Our board has taken a number of advocacy positions, both at the federal level and a little bit at the state level. We advocated to strengthen the CAFE standards, the fuel economy standards, which did pass the Congress last December. Advocated for green-collar job programs and training funds, energy-efficient block grants to local governments, which we're still working on getting the appropriation that has been authorized. On climate legislation, we particularly promoted the role of local governments and regional entities in getting funds out of that legislation. The Warner-Lieberman bill, for example, among others, would raise a large quantity of money. And as originally drafted, there was not a dime for local governments. Now the new versions look like they will have that in there, and maybe in the next Congress we'll get some federal action. We also endorsed at the local, regional level, the Cool Capital Challenge, which is a grassroots campaign that challenges individuals to make commitments, online website of things they will do to reduce their carbon footprint, or business or government. They had a £1 billion goal by September, which they met. A lot of our members did contribute to that. A lot of individuals have contributed, and it was a rather inexpensive way for us to engage the public in this effort, and we're pleased about that. And the last thing, which is a little more controversial, we took a position with a lot of concern about a coal-fired power plant in Wise County, Virginia, far southwest Virginia, that would put off enough carbon dioxide emissions to offset about 2/3 or more of the reductions we're trying to get by 2012. Unfortunately, it looks like that plant is actually going to go forward in spite of our concerns, so it's going to make our challenge even greater. But I think the region and the states are on notice now that they've really got to look at other sources other than coal, and hopefully they'll begin to change their direction. Now, if we go to the next slide, turning to the report, 3 primary sections, the global and regional evidence for climate change, then emissions inventory, and then setting regional reduction targets, which was the real heart of the initial work, and then taking action, looking at ways for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the region from energy, transportation, and land use, as well as looking at some of the economic development side of the issue and preparing for some impacts that are happening already and going to not be completely avoidable, outreach and education, and then where do we go forward with our program. Go to the next slide. We entitled our first section of a report, Facing Facts, Taking Stock, and Taking Aim, and I will now briefly summarize some of the information, next slide, that we took a look at. And I tell people this is one of my all-time favorite slides in the report. It shows the CO2 mountain that has been constructed by the world since 1752. And it's a bit of an estimate going back, but it came out of the United States Department of Energy, and it shows just a phenomenal increase in CO2 emissions since the 1700s, almost all coal-fired initially and then gasoline, fossil fuels. The U.S. is about a little under a quarter of that total in 2002. If we did this in 2008, you'd probably show China about where we are, or maybe even a little bit ahead of us. And the challenge is a global challenge, not just a United States challenge, but as we have noted in our work, there's been not a great deal of leadership in the U.S. in the last number of years, and we're now at the regional level hopefully going to demonstrate that leadership and push our friends up the street on Capitol Hill to take some real action. Go to the next slide. The Pew Center on Climate Change prepared this particular plot. It starts in 1850, goes to 2008 roughly. It shows, starting at the beginning of the 20th century, about a 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit increase, and that corresponds pretty nicely to the huge blob of CO2 in the previous slide. And there is a tremendous scientific consensus that the temperature rise that you are seeing here and that is projected out into the balance of this century, if nothing is done, will continue and will have serious, if not catastrophic, global impacts. Go to the next slide. This takes it a little closer to home. This is the water temperature in the Chesapeake Bay since about 1940 or late 30s. There's a pretty steady average long-term rise of about 0.3 degrees centigrade, about a half a degree Fahrenheit per decade. It's a noisy plot. There's a lot of natural variability in that slide, but the trend up is pretty unmistakable, and if it would not be abated, we could be looking at a 5-degree Fahrenheit rise in this century. And already we're having enough trouble cleaning up the bay at the temperature that it's at. If the temperature should rise that much, we would have trouble dealing with the oxygen in the bay. We'd be affecting our fish species. We'd be affecting the whole productivity of the bay, crabs. There'd be more algal blooms, higher risk of disease. And then if you add onto all of that the fact that the sea level is rising, and there's a plot actually in the report that I don't have on the presentation, and it's already rising and going to continue to rise, and that will bring higher salinity into the bay, which will again change the productivity, as well as create public safety problems along the bay. And both Maryland and Virginia are among the most vulnerable states in the country to this type of problem. Next two slides come from the Maryland Climate Commission, a little bit smaller and not quite as easy to see. Dr. Don Bosch from the University of Maryland produced the next two slides for the Maryland Climate Commission, and he looked at the potential climate change, temperature change effects in particular in Maryland, but actually really did it for the entire Mid-Atlantic region. And if you look closely, what this shows on the left side are the number of 90-degree days in the top panel and the number of 100-degree days in the bottom panel. And you can see there's maybe 30 to 40 90-degree days in the late 20th century that are 90 degrees or above. And there's maybe on average a couple of 100-degree days, and maybe in an urban area a little bit more than that. Well, fast forward to the late 21st century, maybe 75 years from now, and you're looking at an enormous increase in both 90-degree days and 100-degree days, maybe to 60 to 80 or maybe even 100 90-degree days per year, depending on what emission scenario you pick, and then as many as between 10 and 30 100-degree days. And 100-degree days are devastating for lots of reasons, but particularly for public health and the environment. And again, if we don't have enough motivation on a global basis, we're looking at some pretty hot summers around here with no action taken. The next slide shows both the Potomac River on the left and then a little bit into Washington, D.C., of the vulnerability to sea level rise, again produced by Dr. Bosch. While this plot, one would argue, is a little bit speculative because some of the sea level rise numbers are as high as 6 or 7 meters, and that's pretty high end for the forecast. There are some scenarios that could happen, but even a couple of feet could make a big difference. Tropical Storm Hannah was mentioned a little bit earlier tonight and was mentioned in Fairfax County this morning, and about a 1 foot difference would have, if it was 1 foot higher in Fairfax County, they would have had some really devastating effects in a number of the homes that are along the river there, and certainly into the district and the Anacostia as well. So there's just more evidence of the vulnerability that we're looking at. Go to the next slide. This is our greenhouse gas inventory. We did this for the Washington region for a base year of 2005. We have great data in 2005, and that's why we picked it. It covers carbon dioxide as well as carbon dioxide equivalents, which are things like methane, nitrous oxides, and hydrofluorocarbons. The vast majority is just straight CO2. The biggest source is electricity usage on this slide, transportation about a third, and fuel use for heating and industrial uses, not gasoline. Gasoline is part of the transportation pie, is 25%, and then there's a number of other smaller sources that are 4%. And I should also mention that it's not shown on this slide directly, but we did do an analysis. Local governments typically represent about 4% of this total pie. So 96% is everybody else in the community. So solving this problem, while local government needs to lead, it is not going to be solved except by widespread community action. Yes. Fuel use is like heating your home, certain industrial uses for natural gas, generally those types of uses, but not no gasoline usage is in that. That's in the transportation side. So I can get you a much more detailed breakdown of every piece of that pie if you would like. You go to the next slide. This is our forecast for business as usual through 2050. This light is working anymore. Okay. We're back in. I think we're back. We're back in business. Not working. I think. Not sure if it's working or not. It sounds like it's not. Just as a comment while we're waiting, the slides are loaded here, and so you have access to these. You can post them on the city website if you wish. They're available for anyone to go back and review. This slide again shows our forecast of emissions out to 2050 from 2005 under a quote business as usual projection. And it shows that without any steps to reduce emissions, we would look at a 35% increase. That's 35% increase by 2030 and 43% by 2050, which is clearly in the wrong direction given all the science which says you need somewhere between maybe a 50 and a 90% reduction by 2050. This is almost a 50% increase. The good news is that through certain actions that have been taken recently, including by local governments, but also the National Fuel Economy Standards, CAFE, and the energy efficiency requirements, and at least in Maryland, some of the recent actions by the state aimed at reducing energy consumption, you're going to start seeing at least some moderation of that rate of increase. Next slide, we get into our recommendations, and they're divided into the categories you see: regional reduction goals, energy, transportation, land use, economic development, adaptation, financing, outreach, education, and our climate change program. The vast majority of the effort and the recommendations are focused on the first three, and there are some recommendations in the other areas, but the main effort was to set goals and then figure out steps to move toward meeting those goals. So we go to the next slide. We spent a lot of time on this effort, setting regional reduction goals, and there were a couple of important factors that were part of the conversation. First, we looked at goals all across the country and other states. There's not too many examples of regional goals, so most of this was state. There is cool cities and cool counties as well, and these goals resemble what the state of Maryland is doing and also what the cool counties are doing. It does use 2005 as a baseline, and the other key part of the conversation was not to wait to take action, but to move pretty immediately. And so there's a 2012 goal, which is 10% below business as usual, which essentially is keep us at 2005 levels by 2012, which is really our early action goal, and then 2020, which is 20% below 2005, and 2050, which is 80% below 2005. And there was, as I say, a lot of discussion about this. These, as David said in his opening remarks, particularly 2050, but even 2012 and 2020, are going to be stretch goals for our region to meet. We think they're doable. We're already looking at how to meet them in detail, but there's no doubt about it that you're not going to just be able to wave a magic wand to meet these goals. It's going to take some really concerted regional, state, and national effort ultimately. Moving to the next set of recommendations in the area of energy, we have in the report a large number of recommendations. We've tried to simplify them and consolidate them for the purpose of presentation. There is a table called ES1, Executive Summary 1, that lists every single recommendation in the report for anyone who wants to look at them all together. A number of the goals actually are quantitative, very specific goals, and then there's others that set a direction and require more analysis to yield a quantitative goal. For energy, there's really three ways to deal with energy emissions. Either you can be more efficient in your use of energy, and there's examples such as energy efficiency of existing buildings, or in the case of new buildings, our COG policy adopted by our board more than a year ago was our regional green building policy of LEED Silver for all new local government buildings, and actually LEED Certified Plus for all private sector buildings. And so that's one category is energy efficiency. Reducing demand, just using less, as simple as changing a light bulb to a CFL, or as I like to tell people, just shutting them off is a great way to start. But in more elaborate examples, exploring things like a regional energy audit and retrofit program. And this would be pitched at an individual homeowner, and we've actually begun some discussions on how we might do that and how we might partner with folks like Pepco Energy Services or Hannon Armstrong or others that have a real interest in investing in energy efficiency. And then on the other side, local government leading by example, the report calls for finding ways for local governments to reduce their energy use by 15% by 2012, which is a tall order, but again, leading by example, our members of our committee thought this was the way to go. Another one that we're also working on, and I believe Tacoma Park has been contacted, but need to verify that, regional streetlight replacement program. This is a real win-win for everybody. It saves money, it gives better light, and it reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and we're working with the Board of Trade on this, as well as the Clinton Climate Initiative and Hannon Armstrong, that seems to be willing to finance the upfront capital in exchange for some share, perhaps, of the savings, and there's big savings to be gained by that one. And then finally, you can use clean energy, solar, wind, for example, and our report supports a 20% renewable portfolio standard, meaning 20% of the energy coming from renewables across the region, and then it also specifically calls for local governments to purchase 20% of their energy from renewable sources by 2015. Go to the next slide. Transportation, three basic ways, again, to reduce transportation emissions, which were roughly 1/3 of the pie, and perhaps one of the fastest growing pieces of the pie. You can increase fuel efficiency, which such things as California low emission vehicle standards, which go beyond the federal CAFE standards we have endorsed, or other things like transit supportive street designs that give perhaps right-of-ways to buses, for example, or walkable communities would be even better. Reducing VMT, which is really where walkable communities fall in. Our transportation folks are taking a look at the one on the left, shifting short trips under 3 miles from a car to other modes. There's a large number of trips that we believe people may be able to walk or bike or take transit and would make a big difference on greenhouse gas emissions. And on the other side, having local governments fully fund bicycle pedestrian paths, as outlined in the regional transportation plan, would give people, again, better options. And then finally, you can use low-carbon fuels. And we are looking now at a regional green fleet goal that we hope local governments would adopt, and then we hope we can convince the business community to adopt it as well. And this morning or this afternoon in a meeting with the Board of Trade, we talked about taxi cab fleets hopefully adopting such a goal as well. Go to the next slide. Land use is another very important piece of this puzzle, and we've looked at some studies of smart growth, and in some of the studies it shows that you can reduce emissions by as much as 50% from having compact development, and there's obviously many other benefits beyond greenhouse gas emission reduction, but that's a very important factor. We talked about already a little bit about walkable and transit-friendly communities, and a lot of Tacoma Park already, I'd say, is in that direction. And then another one that is really important and has multiple benefits is the issue of preserving our tree canopy. And the report at the moment calls for a no net loss of tree canopy. We actually discussed potentially even pushing for an increase in tree canopy. Besides being a carbon sink and absorbing CO2, trees also will help keep the temperature down, and so they're tremendously important. Just in those two ways, they're obviously important for so many other reasons in terms of community and in terms of habitat and other areas and runoff control. But it's a very, very critical recommendation. And then looking at comprehensive planning, we recommended that local governments incorporate greenhouse gas emission reductions considerations as part of their local comprehensive planning, that be a factor. We also looked at something called LEED neighborhood development standards for guiding new development. A little bit cutting edge, but looks like it has a lot of promise for helping communities grow in a smart growth and lower carbon footprint way. Go ahead to the next slide. The last recommendations cover a number of areas: financing and economic development, outreach and education, adapting to climate change, and our program going forward. In terms of financing, we only began to work on the question of cost and finding the revenue to support a lot of these activities. The McKinsey & Company is a noted consultant, did a lot of work on cost effectiveness of climate strategies, and concluded that there's a lot of them that actually will save money, have a net positive cash flow benefit over the life of the investment, particularly for energy efficiency. And I also mentioned Hannon Armstrong willing to invest money in building retrofits, 500 of them in the Washington region. So the private sector thinks there's money to be made in reducing energy use and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's certainly an area that we're going to focus on, but there's a lot of other ideas on this slide in terms of clean energy funds. The Maryland Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative has funding sources that will come out of the cap and trade program for power plants in Maryland, and there's a lot of other areas that can be looked at, energy performance contracting. Just running through the rest of these, outreach and education is going to be extremely important for galvanizing the public and getting public participation. We've actually begun to partner with a professor who runs a program at George Mason University in Virginia, who actually lives in Montgomery County, who is running a climate communication program. And we're partnering with his class and going to be working on some outreach activities with his marketing class to try to get people to make some changes in their behaviors, both transportation and home energy use. There's a few other ideas: Climate Action Week, Climate Leaders Awards. There's a car-free day coming up in September. Last two areas, adaptation. We just began to look at the potential impacts in this region and how we might begin to adapt to some of the changes that may be very difficult to avoid. We hope to partner perhaps with the University of Maryland, since they did so much work for the state in looking closely at our region specifically on both impacts and an adaptation strategy. And finally, our report calls for converting our committee from an ad hoc committee into a permanent climate and energy policy committee reporting to our board. And their first charge, which frankly, our current committee's got to deal with right away, is preparing a plan on how we're going to achieve our 2012 goal, and we've called for doing that by next June. Next slide. This covers some of the steps I just mentioned. Perhaps the only other two things I'll point out in this slide are tracking reductions. Tracking our progress is going to be very, very important to seeing are we meeting our goals is absolutely essential. And the other thing I would mention on advocacy, and it came up today both in Fairfax and at the Board of Trade, is some of the recommendations are going to require action at the state or federal level. And so our committee and our board is going to need to continue to take a look at what do we need to do on legislation to help advance these recommendations forward. Next slide. As Mayor Williams mentioned, the report is out for public comment to our members, stakeholders, and the general public through September 30th. Our committee will meet again in October, and our board will receive the final recommendations in November, and hopefully we'll take action to adopt our report, and then we move forward in implementation. And the last slide shows a very long link on how to obtain an electronic copy of the report. If you just go to mwcog.org and look on our front page, it'll take you there. But if you want to go directly, that first link takes you there directly. The comment page is a little simpler, mwcog.org/environment/climate/public. Very nice forms you can fill out, and all the comments are actually recorded, and you can look at what other people are doing, so there's a little bit of a feel of a blog. And then finally, if anyone has specific questions that I'm not going to have time to answer tonight, or you would like to ask me separately, you've got my phone number and my email. Mr. Mayor and council members, concludes the prepared report. Happy to take your questions. Appreciate your forbearance in listening to that long report. It's okay. It's all right. It's alive and kicking. So, thank you for handling my slide change.
Pretty good shape. Sort of good thought.
Okay. We'll come a little more family friendly here up to the table.
I want to thank you both for taking this show on the road. I think it was a pretty comprehensive presentation. I know there are a lot of details behind it. I just wanted to start by saying that I feel in many ways like Tacoma Park was out front on this issue in terms of our involvement with the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives and the grant funding that we got to generate our own greenhouse gas reduction plan in about 2000. And I think we started well, and then we kind of fell by the wayside, and we have some good things in place, but there are other things that we could have been doing that we haven't been doing. And so I feel in some ways like while we kind of slowed down, everybody else started speeding up, and I feel like there's a whole lot of unanimity of support and concern on this issue among our colleagues in other jurisdictions in this region and around the country, and I think around the world. And I look forward to the opportunity to work through COG with our regional partners to work on this issue and come up with some better solutions. Can you just say a little bit about what you think the permanent committee, if it gets formed, which I assume it will, the envisioned representation, and a little bit about the approach that committee might take and that COG might take in partnering with member jurisdictions? I can see a lot of sharing of information, but I wondered about maybe some kind of harder things in terms of spending some time, some staff time, working with local jurisdictions to try and provide some ways to implement some of these things a little better. Just wondering what's envisioned.
Well, at least start.
Since COG is usually kind of all about convening meetings and bringing people together, but not necessarily and providing information and tracking things and reports, but not necessarily kind of in the implementation phase of things.
I think this committee actually, as envisioned, will be different because it's not just going to be an information exchange committee, but it is going to be a committee that's going to be charged with supervising the implementation of the recommendations. Some of them, of course, will have to be carried out by even other committees at COG, like the Transportation Planning Board. But in general, I think that's going to be its fundamental role, tracking implementation, but certainly networking and best practice sharing. I expect it'll have all members of COG represented on it. I expect that it will have state representation from both the environmental side, perhaps the energy side, and the transportation side. And then the other area is going to be stakeholder participation, and that's something that the report calls for. But the specifics of that will need to be determined by the members of COG, both the business community, environmental community in particular. I think will have a strong interest. And its first task is going to be to figure out how we get to the 2012 goal. But your comment about support to members has been made by a number of members, both big and small, by the way, not just limited to smaller jurisdictions. And it's an area that we're going to need to spend some time figuring out how to most effectively do, and our capacity has been stretched a bit with this report as well. ICLEI, by the way, does have a lot of tools, the group that you mentioned, and a lot of those tools I think can be helpful, but nevertheless, how you use them and how you use them effectively is something that we hope we can help our members do and learn how to do on maybe a more efficient group basis and sharing what's involved in using a tool like that. And then, as I mentioned, things like the streetlight program, we are actively engaged and bring partners together to help, particularly when the city owns its own lights as opposed to the power company. You have control of what you do, presumably, and therefore you can either just get advice on what to do and you put up the upfront capital, or you can use someone else's capital in exchange for some share of the savings in both the maintenance side, by the way, as well as the electricity usage side. So those green fleets are another one we hope to really partner with our members and some of the other folks in the region, the business community. So there's a number of areas like that. That's at least a start.
Yeah, I know on the streetlights we put a fair amount of energy into trying to come up with some alternatives from Pepco, and talked about becoming our own electric utility, and we haven't gone there, but we put a fair amount of work into it. And I like hearing that there's the potential to partner with some organizations for funding, because in many ways that limits our ability, not having that funding, to do some of the things that we recognize that we need to do. You said a little bit in the beginning about the state report. If you can just flesh that out just a little bit, because it sounded like you were saying we should get them to come give their report.
Well, the report was just issued only within the last 2 weeks. They had a much larger process than we've been able to afford to go through in terms of involvement in preparing that report. It also sets an early goal, kind of a middle goal, and a aggressive 2050 goal. They've actually recommended a 90% reduction from 2006 levels by 2050, and we're about 80%. It's close. And there's a 2012 goal, and I believe there's also a 2015 goal for energy reduction per capita energy use in Maryland, 15% by 2015, that was passed into state law. There's a number of other incentive programs that are in there to incent people and hopefully local governments to purchase renewable energy, for example. And there's something like 42 recommendations that, according to the state, add up to meeting their goal of a 25 to 50% reduction by, I think, 2025 below 2006 levels. It's a very aggressive goal, and they have a package that they say adds up to achieve that number. And that's gone a little further than we've been able to go, and so that's why I would commend you to have them present that here. And also because of the state and local relationship and how that would work, I think that's a little different than more of the networking at COG, so I think that's another reason to hear from them. And, they've done some great work on the science too, which is really cutting edge.
Just one other quick comment by me, and then I'll get questions and comments from my colleagues. I was noting that in, what was it, 2 weeks, that when we have kind of public safety night, one of the items that might be coming to us for some discussion is the possibility of hybrid vehicles for police vehicles. And I didn't know if you've had any input from any of our fellow jurisdictions or any knowledge about heading in that direction. It sounded from what the city manager said like she was going to push it, but I don't have any of the details.
I'd have to really check. We, of course, have a cooperative purchasing program that purchases police vehicles, but I don't recall if any of them have been hybrids yet.
Yeah, my understanding, working with the police chiefs and the CAO's group and others, that there's obviously a strong push for joint purchasing of fleets, or just standardization sometimes of the different makes and models. To the best of my knowledge, there's been no collective regional decision around establishing a standard for hybrid for law enforcement vehicles, more for public works and a variety of other purposes. I'm not an expert in that. There may be sort of some performance and speed issues. I have a hybrid vehicle. I don't think I'd win any races with it, but it's a perfectly wonderful, efficient car, and it gets you where you need to be.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the thought that this might be possible, since it's probably more than 50% of our vehicle fleet. So, Councilmember Snipper.
Yes, thank you very much. This has been really interesting. I have a question or two. I'll try to make it a softball question, if I can. I don't mean it to sound hostile. I have been attending the Transportation Planning Board meetings at COG, and one of the things that has struck me is the emphasis on supporting cars rather than alternative transportation. It's hard to see in the current TPB's plans any real effort in any dramatic way anyway towards goals like you have in this report. And so I wondered, I'll get to the question part. The question part is, could you talk a little bit about, how can I say this? Could you talk a little bit about how your efforts to reorient COG staff to push harder for policies that are alternative forms of transit friendly rather than cars? I can give you a concrete example. When there was a discussion of adding a bus lane along the side of a highway in the at least during rush hour, the TPB staff were completely dismissive of taking the whatever you call it lane, the breakdown lane for that, just totally dismissed it out of hand. So I wonder if you have a plan for moving forward with the staff at COG.
Okay, as the staff director, the executive director, I'll maybe take a swipe at that, and maybe Stuart can jump in and help with it. You know, it's a challenge for the organization. One of the Mayor Williams, having been long associated with COG, knows that some folks feel that COG is staff-directed, and some folks feel that the elected officials sort of have their hands on the steering wheel, and it's probably a little bit of both. I'm not sure of the specific meeting TPB. I tend or sit in on most of those, so I don't know the specific one that you were referencing. I think we have outstanding transportation staff as we have outstanding environmental staff and others, but I will say that the MPO side, the TPB side of COG, is challenged to sort of consider all of the modes, transit, highways, and others, and I can't say that the sort of the highway and the road piece doesn't maybe perhaps at times have maybe a slightly stronger voice, and it has advocates, and again, in balancing those advocates between highway and transit and pedestrian and different modes is a challenge to the state DOTs, and again, I think we have great state DOTs in our region, but have significant voice in the MPO process. I'm not saying that's bad or good, it's just a sort of an observation. So I, again, not knowing the specifics of the one that you've referenced, I think on balance the staff's role has been to try and provide the best professional and technical information that we can, and then ultimately the public officials on TPB will have to make their choices. The state DOTs have significant voice in those discussions as members of TPB, but on balance I think they mostly get it right. The one opportunity why I'm particularly excited about what we've done through this climate change is I think it has, Stuart talked about changing business as usual. I think it has the potential to change business as usual throughout COG, not just sort of stovepiping the climate and environmental discussions in one room, but to sort of have that filter through the entire organization. And I'm struck, and many of you may have seen the article in the paper over the weekend, but California is considering legislation, I think it's called SB 375, that would, on the state level, and we're tri-state, so that makes it a little more interesting, but that would link transportation and land use and environmental issues, so that in California, they would establish targets for CO2 reductions in regions, and that transportation projects that further compact-oriented development would be more favorably examined through the MPO process within the state. Now, we're not there yet, but I think the work that we're taking, the steps that we're taking, the presentation this evening and the support we hope to build regionally for the work, I think moves us in that direction in some incremental stages. So it's not a specific answer to your very specific question, but I think at least an acknowledgement that business as usual, I hope, will be changing in our organization. If not a willingness to do that, we really shouldn't have gone down this path, because the intention really is to change fundamentally the way that we do our work.
A quick follow-up. I agree thoroughly with your assessment that COG is driven by both the politicos, the elected officials, and the staff, which is why I asked you about the staff. And I urge you to consider some staff training, perhaps changing performance stuff in people's pay plans, things that will at least push the part of COG that you have most say over, which is the staff, towards constantly reminding people and themselves that they need to think about alternatives that emphasize things that will get us where we need to go.
It would be helpful if you can even let me know offline if you remember the specific project example, because I'm a little surprised about the fact that it was dismissed out of hand, since bus right-of-ways in general are rather important to provide, because if you can't make the bus service competitive with taking a car, people are going to say, well, it's too slow and too, too this, too that, might as well drive. So there may be a safety issue here, but it would be helpful if you know specifically. And I'll handle more the technical side and let David handle more of the staff policy side. I would like to know, because that specific idea has come up in other forums as a way to help public transit have some at least equality, if not an advantage, with driving, and it's going to be critical to its success, and we need to be able to head in directions like that. If transit is, we can spend lots of money on buses. If they can't get through the traffic, it's not going to be very effective.
Well, I've always been in favor of dedicated bus lanes that ran opposite to the direction of cars, because when they run opposite to the direction of cars, the cars are much less likely to go into the bus lane.
Except where I grew up in Massachusetts, maybe, but no, you're right.
Well, I watched this in Puerto Rico, and it was pretty notable, let's say. You see a bus barreling down, and they can go really fast when they have a dedicated lane. You don't have to have dividers particularly even, and it doesn't have to be expensive. And the cars get out of the way.
Well, it's interesting because roundabouts actually, which
yes,
tend to sometimes be off-putting in theory, in fact, are incredibly efficient.
Yes.
And there's fewer accidents with them, amazingly enough. And they're getting a serious look again, finally.
Right.
So
I'm
point
a
is
big
well
fan
taken.
of those two.
Councilmember Wright.
One comment, one request, and then one question. The first was, David, I really appreciated this connection you were starting to make between national security and climate change. And I think just to make an explicit connection, to me, climate change isn't just an environmental issue, but also a national security issue, because if you look at the predictions of the potential for a number of failed states as a result of increase in temperature, it's pretty astronomical, and what that's going to do in terms of hot spots around the world that our country will have to deal with in terms of failed states and potential for terrorism and affect national security is big, and then also the increasing connection between fuel prices and food prices are also driving potential for failed states and national security issues. So I wanted to be explicit about that. The second was, I think something that would be very helpful if we can figure out how to do it, and something that COG can provide is helping us to also do that accounting you were talking about, or the tracking. So we've talked about a little bit about that here on the council and gotten some input from our environmental committee that it's just a daunting task to, for a municipality to figure out a way to really give yourself a scorecard and keep track of in a way that's relatively accurate and meaningful, but doesn't burden the city with too much record keeping. So anything that can be sort of a bottoms-up approach where it can then be fed back to the city so we can have a scorecard, that would be very helpful. And then, Stuart, I had a question about the 2050 goal. How much of that involves, I mean, you talked a lot about energy efficiency and some of the changes we can make sooner. How much of reaching that goal involves things like, that I think are more controversial, like clean coal / carbon sequestering and nuclear power, which, there's a lot of questions about here in Tacoma Park and concern about the waste associated with that. So how much getting to that goal really requires those sorts of changes that I think might have either be questionable in their ability to achieve when you get to carbon sequestering, or might have other negatives when you get to things like
I guess I'll give you a couple answers. We have not really tried yet to take a look at what it would take to reach the 2050 goal. We've been looking at 2012 and 2020. But there's no doubt that to reach a 2050 goal and an 80% reduction from where we are or higher is going to have to take some really major changes in technology. You've got to get off of carbon fuels onto something else. And this report advocates renewables. Primarily, nuclear power was discussed, but there's no real position taken in this report about nuclear power. There's a split in the COG membership on it. There's a split in the environmental community on it. I think you are going to find that, at least in the near term, people are going to look at it as part of the solution, for better or for worse. But again, we call for a 20% renewable portfolio standard by 2020 in this report. And if you actually take a look at what that would mean, it would mean almost all your power by 2020, new power sources, and some replacement coming from renewables if you're going to have to achieve it. On the vehicle side, I think, well, just to touch on clean coal and carbon sequestration, I've seen a fair amount of material on that whole question. There's a lot of research going on. At best, you might have something in the 2020 plus time frame. So if you build coal plants today, which we're still building, there is no such thing as carbon sequestration. And if there's no solution that sequesters that carbon ever, then until those plants are phased out, we've built in a big carbon source. Some people are very optimistic about it. I think it's more, there's a lot of coal in this country, there's a lot of industry associated with it, and those folks would like to find a way to feel greener and maintain their business. It remains to be seen whether that technology is going to be viable. And on the vehicle side, I'm very excited that there's going to be some really new technology coming out in 2010. Plug-in hybrids are going to begin to come on the scene. Of course, if you plug them in and you get your energy from coal-fired plants, you're nowhere near as effective as if you get it from renewables. But it is a net reduction even from coal. And running 100 miles, most of your trips could be on the battery. That's a big improvement than gasoline. And eventually, natural gas is back in the picture again. It had been around and it's kind of come and gone and seems to be back again. It's a carbon fuel, but it's much more carbon friendly in terms of CO2 emissions. So as a transitional fuel, I think you may be looking there too.
Councilmember Robinson.
Thank you for coming and making that great presentation.
Thank you.
We're a small town. As Mayor Williams has said, we had goals. We felt we were on the maybe getting close to a cutting edge, and in the past 10 years or so, maybe languished a little bit in our own efforts. That's what it seems like from my very recent position on the council. But we want to do well, and we want to show well and lead our own citizens, and maybe even be an example for other cities our size or even larger. So the will is here to do it. And as you said, 4% of the use is in local governments, and that leaves 96% in the folks who are our constituents, at least within our borders. So we have a challenge too, a big challenge, taking our small use of energy and kind of leveraging that into an example for our own citizens. We have a committee on the environment. Catherine Tunis, the long-term chair, is sitting right behind you. So she has a challenge, how to convince us on this council and our own constituents, and we have issues of how do we interact with folks outside. So how do we interact with our own neighboring jurisdictions and you and the Council of Governments? And certainly Mayor Williams has had a long and illustrious efforts in that regard. So kudos to him. But in looking at our in the whole metro area, how will we make the most impact? And we need to know, we need help from you, continuing help from you on how to know how to do that. So what crossed my mind, and here comes a kind of a leap of faith, or a suggestion that might be out there for you, but it does seem to me that COG, because you represent the metro area, have a crucial role to play for us because we're a metro jurisdiction. And as your presentation shows, there's a lot of bad news, potential bad news out there. So if we want to get from here to 2050, there's the carrot, you could say there's the carrot and the stick. And the stick is we're losing ground, we're not meeting our goals, we're burning too much coal, why aren't we going fast enough? But where's the carrot? And that's, I'll kind of bring it back to the beginning. Where's our carrot for doing a good job? How do we get kudos? Well, of course, we want to reduce our own energy footprint, but what can you give us? And here's a kind of a suggestion. Why don't you put on like an Academy Awards of good deeds for local jurisdictions or what have you, so that every year, or we had something to work toward, so that maybe we get the gold star that year. Hey, we did more conversion of our fleet to hybrids than any other jurisdiction, and we go down to the COG Awards, And we're recognized for that. And other jurisdictions go, oh, gee, Tacoma Park did a good job. That puts us back in a leadership position. It puts you in a position of offering a carrot. And maybe it's one of many roads to getting to 2050 in a way that's helpful for us all. So.
No, I think that's a great suggestion, and we do hope to come up with an awards program. I kind of like the ring of an Academy Award of Good Deeds, so I think we should do that. I also think that everything I've heard that you are doing is on the right track. I mean, whether your police vehicles ultimately become hybrids or some at least higher fuel efficiency police vehicle is absolutely in the right direction. Walkable communities is in the right direction. You're looking at your building energy use. You're looking at you've already, I think, you participate in the county's renewable energy purchase. So, you know, at one level, this sounds like a really complex problem, and it is. At another level, it's energy consumption, it's fuel consumption, and at some level, as you know, the Washington Post reporter called me up. He said, "Well, Stuart, what can people do?" And I say, "Well, the first thing they can do is turn off the lights and things in their house that they don't need, unplug their." Your cable people are not here, but unplug their cable boxes, which just sit there and drain a lot of energy. Unplug lots of, you know, their coffee pots and their toasters and stuff like that when they're not using. I mean, just basic activity, and insulating their homes. You know, just it's a lot of common sense, frankly, and it applies to government as well. And buildings like this probably have a lot of potential because they're a little bit older, and so you can make a big jump here in this building by your lighting, by your heating and cooling system. Even if you didn't do anything else but those two things, you might get some real benefit. Your roof, another area to take a look at. You know, maybe some solar panels, maybe little wind turbines. I think we talked about that once a while ago. So I think there's a lot of things that you can begin to do that will be cost effective, and then the state's going to have to help. The federal government's going to have to help. I mean, this is not a problem solved by local government, but perhaps kick-started or led by local government.
And local government has been taking the lead on this for far too long, without the federal leadership.
Yes. So I think what you've done so far is great, and we hope that you'll come to our Academy Awards when we hold it and get one of those awards.
Thanks.
Councilmember Stevens.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, David, I would like to thank you for your leadership in bringing this initiative together. I know it took a lot of work to get it to the point it is now, and I'm really glad to see that you were able to garner the support so this is on the table now and in front of everyone where it belongs. Thank you. Thank you. I'm just kind of curious when, I know looking back at what Council of Governments has done in the past on other initiatives and campaigns, this is a massive one, and I wonder when we can expect to see your first media campaign to really a concerted effort to educate the public and also to offer specific suggestions for steps that residents can take. I think one of the problems that I see is you know, Stuart was listing a whole laundry list of possible things it can do, but I think it would be helpful for the community to hear, you know, one or two items, you know, install CFLs now or whatever it is, and start to see those in front of the public throughout the region. And I just wondered what, scheduling-wise, what your plans are.
Well, yeah, I'll jump in, and then Stuart can maybe comment. I think you're right. We need some very clear, cogent messages to the public, similar to with Homeland Security. You know, be ready, make a plan. So you know exactly what you got to do. I think once we get the support of our member jurisdictions, and we hope that will begin this process in this community this evening, and we go forward to the COG Board of Directors in November, once we essentially have a green light to move forward on this, the work will begin. As Stuart said, we're looking to sort of restructure and maybe more integrated our committee structure, do the implementation plan, and that outreach and education component that was shown up there on the slide really is part of that, and to sort of pick 2 or 3 things that we think can have most impact on our member governments and our residents throughout our region and our businesses. And so for a homeowner, it might be, as I've done, you replace as the bulbs burn out sort of with the compact fluorescent, so you're not running out necessarily and buying all new bulbs, but you sort of do it one at a time. If you're looking at a purchase of a new vehicle, look at one that is most fuel efficient or a hybrid to sort of build that in. And I think in governments and businesses can have sort of similar, but I think better, as you suggested, to pick 2 or 3 things that are doable rather than have a menu of so many choices that perhaps it becomes a bit frustrating. Stuart, I don't know if you want to add to that or...
Just a few brief additions. We actually have several outreach programs at COG already that focus on mostly other areas. Commuter Connections does ride matching, telecommuting, helps people with transit, helps get them home if they need to in an emergency. And they have begun to take on the issue of climate change and promoting some of the actions for being climate friendly. So we're working with that program. Our Clean Air Partners, which has been focused on, Code Red ozone days for years, has just added a greenhouse gas emission reduction to its portfolio, and that's another one. Our WISE water use effort is another campaign that using less water actually saves water, but it also saves energy. It takes a lot of energy to treat water, to transport water to your home, to heat it up for hot water. So that's another one. And our board at our COG retreat called for a wise energy use campaign. Now we've got to try to wrap these together into a coherent package and not have 4 stovepipes of COG running off in complementary areas. So that's a little bit of it's a staff challenge. But we've got to focus, as David said. We've talked about a top 10 tips. It sounds like maybe we ought to start with top 2 tips or top 3 tips before we try to go to top 10. But absolutely critical to meeting this.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have a real opportunity here in the beginning stages with picking the low-hanging fruit, as they say, but the packaging, and that's where I think the Council of Governments can really help local governments, is with putting the package together and make it a concerted effort across the region. And I just want to make sure that you're leaving here tonight with full recognition that this council strongly supports your initiative. Do we take a vote on that, or how do we make that clear?
Anybody disagree with that statement?
Question.
Thank you, Councilmember Stevens.
I installed a CFL yesterday in my kitchen, and as a result of someone else's public education effort, I started buying organic bananas, because, not that I'm going to use them as alternative fuel, but although that may be a possibility, but I learned that non-organic bananas are subject to pesticides in Central and South America, where they're predominantly grown, and as a result they're killing migratory birds who then feed on those bananas, ingest the poison, and this is having an adverse effect on the ecosystem of which those migratory birds are part of. So the education part does work, at least on me. But what I wanted to ask you is, you've done an excellent job of pointing out the things that we can do, that individuals can do. But there's some things that still require federal government support and assistance, and one of them is something I worryingly read the other day that had to do with our power grid, the national one. And the story went on to say that for all T. Boone Pickens discussions about investing billions in wind power, the grid is so decrepit and so fragmented across the country that even if we had all these alternative fuels, adding them to the grid is problematic because of the condition of it. And I'd like to know, do you believe that that is true? That is your experience with the grid in general? And if it is there something that we at the local level can do? Maybe T. Boone, can spend hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying the federal government to improve the grid and modernize it so that it can be flexible enough and large enough and robust enough to manage all of these alternative fuels, electricity, power generated from it that will go through the grid. But what can we do to influence those kinds of infrastructure things that without them, we're kind of, blowing in the wind, so to speak.
Well, I won't claim to be an expert on the power grid. I've read the same reports and heard the same concerns. And one couple of things I can say are, if you go to central power stations of wind farms or solar farms or any renewable, and it's centralized, whether it's coal or renewable, you still got to transport that power to people. And that whole transmission system is not only fragile and potentially inefficient, it's also rather controversial. It's being witnessed right now in Northern Virginia, where there's a power line proposal there, and there's been objections in Pennsylvania lately about whether you should build it. So an area that I think has a lot of promise but needs a lot of time and financial investment is disaggregating these investments, going to solar power in buildings, wind power, wind turbines on buildings, geothermal energy type sources that may very well help meet a lot of the demand without having to build as many big plants in the future. And so I'd like to see some real push in that direction. We've had some conversation with Fairfax County about that today, and the county executive there would like to put solar on every school building and every county building, and it's still very, very expensive. And there's got to be, if we're willing to subsidize many things in this country, we ought to subsidize solar energy. And New Jersey, for example, has a big state support for solar, and I've visited water plants up there that get a tremendous amount of their power from solar installations right on the site, and they give actually back to the grid. So I think that's some direction that we need to take a look at. I think Maryland is wanting to push in that direction at this point. So I'd say the grid is a concern, and it has been raised, and there are at least a few ways maybe to get around some of it with some of these measures. So it's a real concern.
And that reminded me of one thing. I can't remember whether I mentioned it previously to you or not, that one of the things that I understand is lacking in this metropolitan area is an opportunity for the many farmers who participate in the farmers markets in this region, and I think Tacoma Park had one of the first of those in 1983, and it's been very successful. But what they don't have is a opportunity for a value-added kitchen to increase the supply of locally grown food and its availability in different forms other than fresh, so that one of the things that we've been looking at is opportunities to establish value-added kitchens for locally grown food in the region. There is none currently.
Well, we do call for promoting, generally speaking, locally grown food in this report.
Right.
And I should also mention, it's a little bit under the radar screen on our website, but there actually is a part of our website that lists farmers that can supply food into the region, farmers markets. I cannot vouch for whether the Tacoma Park one is listed. I hope it is, but if it's not, we'll make sure it is. And we do actually have a committee that coordinates among farmers, and it's a little bit even beyond the region that is working on this effort. And hopefully that, combined with this report and your thought there, might get us someplace in reinforcing that whole market system. There's less transportation of food and, of course, promoting our local business.
Yeah, we now have 2 farmers markets.
Yes, well, we better get both of them on there.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you both very much for doing this, and we'll make sure to get you some comments by the 30th.
Please do.
Thank you very much.
And we'll take a short break and come back for the rest of our meeting, and we'll come back at 9:35 on that clock. work session, and the first of two items is the proposed amendment to the City Code revising stormwater review fee and permit fee for institutional, industrial, and commercial facilities. And the Public Works Director
Darryl,
is here.
you're on.
I'm sorry.
Oh, we can keep you here longer.
Did we do consent agenda?
We did.
Okay, so now we're on to stormwater?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Basically, the cover sheet kind of summarizes the situation we're in a nutshell. Back in April, the council adjusted or amended the stormwater code to address a couple of things. One was staff recommendation that the commercial, industrial, and institutional construction permits and stormwater process was wide enough so that many development activities weren't regulated, weren't required to receive a stormwater permit. The existing code language had that if you were greater than 5,000 square feet, you were exempt. So a staff recommendation was to take care of that issue and require that any commercial, industrial, and institutional construction would have to go through the stormwater process because of the potential there to make significant improvements in the stormwater runoff, and also the potential there for possible harm related to the construction or the ongoing use of the land in those ways. So that was a change to the existing code. We also became aware that there was a fee structure that was missing in the original language that had been in place for several years, so we made some recommendations about permit fees. In working with the fee structure that was recommended by the city engineer, it became apparent to us that there was ways in which that our fee structure in some cases was providing a much lower permit charge than was found in some area jurisdictions, and in some ways was in other types of development was asking for a much larger permit fee, in some cases 3 and 4 times larger than some other jurisdictions. So we had some internal staff discussions about the best way to address that, and the recommendation that we came up with was to add a minimum and a maximum to the permit fee structure for commercial, industrial, and institutional development activities, so that we would basically try to make sure that the costs that the city was assessing based on the city engineer's time for permit review, as well as the potential impact of the construction activity itself and the ongoing use of the land in that way, would be at a reasonable rate. So what you see proposed before you is that addition in language to the existing city code, so that we would basically capture a minimum and maximum in those specific instances to try to make sure that we're in line with fees charged in similar areas. It's still very difficult to compare ourselves with other jurisdictions because there are uniquenesses and differences in each city. There aren't a lot of jurisdictions that have taken over stormwater management in the way that the city has. The most nearby jurisdictions that we can look to as peers is the city of Gaithersburg, the city of Rockville, and Montgomery County. What you'll find with Montgomery County's permit fee, which is different than ours, is it also includes the sediment and erosion control. So they have joined together those permit processes. They're not separate. So in that ways, the permit that you go through in Montgomery County is indeed kind of a larger process than you have here in the city. The other kind of unique situation that developers will be in our area is they have to get both the City of Tacoma Park stormwater permit, and they're still required to go through the Montgomery County process. Generally what happens is the stormwater requirements on the county level, they basically say follow the city's requirements, and then the county does the sediment and erosion control. So for developers, they end up having to basically not go through the exact same process, but go through a long and challenging process for permit application and development. And so we're trying to put together a system that is both reasonable as well as achieves what we're trying to achieve, which is in some ways provide some incentives for doing additional water quality and water quantity control than may be necessary in some places. One of the ways where I think you can see that best is, for instance, in the city of Rockville and the city of Gaithersburg, their stormwater fees are based on a square footage, or rather a cost of the stormwater management structure. So they basically set up their stormwater fee system so that if your stormwater management system costs $1,000, the fee is 10%. That focuses the program on the cost of the infrastructure themselves. Montgomery County, it's a square foot of disturbance, depending on how much land you disturb, then they have a rate equivalent of that. What we tried to do in the city's law, and it's been that way all along, is we're really taking a look at impervious area. We're really trying to make that connection between what you're actually doing on the surface of the land and what the impact will be in a stormwater quality mode. So we very much like that aspect of the city's law. It focuses on impervious area. And if you're a developer trying to figure out what's most economical and advantageous for you, we want to make sure that you're encouraged to reduce impervious area versus increase impervious area, and that it's not simply how much of your land are you covering with a building, but perhaps taking a look at green roofs or pervious pavement. And in, say, for instance, in the Montgomery County mode, those would still be considered disturbed areas, so they'd still count, and you'd have to pay an equivalent fee for there. In our mode, if you were making those improvements and reducing the imperviousness of your lot, you wouldn't be charged again for that. It wouldn't be a component of your fee. We're really trying to capture the imperviousness and make that the focus of the stormwater permit fee decision. So at any rate, that's what you have in front of you there. Every situation is different. You know, every new development activity that comes through the door can show us something. So we're basically, we decided that coming up with that minimum and maximum in terms of the permit fee would provide the best information for anybody trying to evaluate development activities before they even got started, so they can know sort of best case, worst case scenario. And it also would allow us to continue to implement based on a permeability kind of factor, so that our ordinance would try to be encouraging those types of activities among developers. So I don't know if you have any other specific questions related to that. We included, of course, the ordinance has its own language changes, but then we tried to give you a spreadsheet comparing Gaithersburg, Rockville, the county, and our old system, and then our proposed system, and the bottom line charges that a developer might experience. Now, obviously, we have some situations in the city of Tacoma Park that may or may not have similar expressions in other areas. We're going to tend to be an infill development kind of situation that probably already has a building. We're not going to have 25-acre lots. They're going to be fairly small. So in some ways, we're still in an apples to orange type of comparison in this, but we tried to present some realistic examples that we have. In fact, in both these examples, there are real live permit applications that came through the door, so we could you know, show you sort of exactly the type of things that we're dealing with and approaching.
Questions? Councilmember Snipper.
Thank you. Mayor, could you explain a little bit, so there's a review fee and then the actual permit fee.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit, say a little bit more about that?
Sure.
Would you, it seems like you would do both most of the time.
Yes, yes, you would do both. You would do both. Unless you decided you weren't going to go ahead with your construction, then you might have entered the process and gone through the review process and then decided either the economics changed or situation changed or you didn't buy what you thought you were going to buy, and you would proceed to the permit stage. But basically, in every case, the concept review is the initial opportunity the city engineer and the developers have to sit down and sort of look at their plan. It's also the time where the most back and forth goes on, where the city engineer can say, have you considered this, have you considered that, what about this, what about that, and can also sort of let the developer know, listen, I think this is a very sensitive area, you've got a steep slope, or you're right next to Sligo Creek, and we're going to take a look at this in a more significant way than we might if you were on a flat slope. There are sections of the code, and again, we kept it fairly simple, but we do have some latitude within the department to require additional requirements upon the developers based on certain conditions that may or may not exist in a development. So, and there's also opportunities that they have to request waivers of certain components of our law. So there's a bit of a give and take, and the concept review period is really where you start kind of working it out. It takes a significant amount of the city engineer's time to go through the proposals. They oftentimes are revised and revised again through that process. And then once the city engineer has reviewed it and is comfortable with the plan, he gives them basically a concept approval. And then the developer and their engineers go back, finalize all the aspects of the project, and then reapply through the permit process. But of course, when we see it for the second time, we know what's coming through, we know what the development is, and we know what the avenues are that they're planning to use to handle or address both quality and quantity control in their stormwater programs.
Do you get a lot of, sorry, do you get a lot of, just to follow up here, do you get a lot of situations in which there is a fair amount of back and forth?
Oh, yes, yes.
Because then the fee seems relatively low in that case. It doesn't seem like we're covering our costs.
Well, it's a bit of a balancing act, you know. On one hand, we want to try to be encouraging and make sure we open up ideas or concepts that might not have been considered originally. And sometimes we find willingness among the developer themselves to take extra steps that they either weren't aware of or were kind of enhanced during the discussion.
Councilmember Sniffer, this is where there's a lot of back and forth also with the planners here, the county staff, and that kind of thing. So some of the costs of that portion are with the other kinds of permit fees and review fees about that. I mean, it's a very collaborative effort at that review stage.
Because that is my question. Is the fee high enough to cover our costs?
Well, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the city engineer was sort of back of the envelope. You know, how many hours does he average in a concept review fee? And he was quite comfortable with the fee system that we had set up, particularly with the minimum and maximum. I mean, again, when you're looking at a single-family development, fairly straightforward, not a whole lot of issues that are going to be encountered. Those tend to be, you know, pretty simple, and others tend to be more complicated. But the work and the onus really ends up being on the developer and the engineers. You know, we're basically in a situation where we can ask questions, we can make suggestions, but they're the ones that have to sort of do the homework, price it out. I mean, it really is, the onus is more on the applicant than us. We're sort of have the enviable position of pointing out the flaws or identifying other options, and in that way we're engaged, but it's not quite the same kind of time frame as it is for the developer and their engineer. And again, you try to balance those things out.
So you're comfortable that your staff isn't spending more than $100 on these kinds of things in terms of staff time?
Well, in terms of concept review, with the single-family houses, that's pretty much set up at the $100 fee. For multifamily, which I don't recall that we've had any since I've been aware of it, but there's the option there of breaking it down for a minimum of $100 and individually $20 a unit. And then when you get with the commercial, industrial, and institutional, which is by far going to be where you've got more complex issues to deal with, that's where we've done the 5 cents per square foot and established the minimum and maximum not to be above $1,000.
But it does, I guess my question is prompted by, I can easily imagine staff time being $100 an hour for this.
Well, I don't recall the rate of our city engineer, but you know,
well, I'm thinking of the total costs of these things, not just the. That's what I was wondering. All right.
Councilmember Klein.
I'm a little brain dead right now, so if I get it wrong, just let me know. So my question is, about the examples, and thank you for doing these. It's very helpful. So I can see how you've got a new building and you end up with an impervious surface of 5,000 square feet. You have a $2,000 fee, and you don't max out your total fees. In the next example, though, you end up with 62,300 square feet of impervious area, but you cap out at $5,000 because of the $1,000 and $4,000 cap. So you have a $5,000 fee. Where before we had an $18,690 fee. So my question is, if you're a developer, you've got all this impervious surface, and you know that your stormwater fee is going to cap out at $5,000, what's your incentive to do any other kinds of alternative stormwater management that we might like, for example, a green roof? Because the change from $18,000 to $5,000 isn't based on them doing any of these additional green things, right?
Well, actually, in that particular case, they did a green roof, and that was actually discussed in the concept review and came in the final permit. So we were successful there and had a very willing participant in terms of taking a look at issues. The interesting thing there was to do that development without adding impervious area and yet adding square footage to the building. So again, you can't sort of show all details in any given example, but it's a fairly novel use of space. And again, it kind of it reflects a lot of what we're going to have here. Existing buildings, how do you make them greener? How do you expand and reuse the space? And in this case, both because the parking area was pretty much already, covering the entire lot, there wasn't a whole lot that he could do. But he did make the decision to do several things, including the green roof and including some quality control issues, Filterra type systems in his stormwater retrofits, which were additional measures.
So did that developer do that because it reduced his stormwater fee? And if we do this cap, so that it caps out at $5,000, what's going to be anyone's motivation in the future to do that? Is it will it affect that, or am I getting this right?
Well, again, it's a little bit of a crystal ball kind of thing. We don't really know, and we're trying to, this situation is actually what catapulted us into having this discussion with the city manager, because at this point the developer's saying, listen, I'm doing all this stuff, and you guys are going to charge me this enormous stormwater fee. That's what gives, and if I were in Gaithersburg or Rockville, it wouldn't be that way. So we thought that they had a point, and in fact we wanted to be able to weigh those factors in with the system. And we went through a lot of different permutations of what the fee structure might be, and we came down to kind of sticking with what we had with some bookends on either end. I mean, one of the things we were looking at is the percentage of land that was covered. And that, again, gets a bit at the permeable and impermeable nature of it. But granted, a lot of our developments are going to already be existing buildings, so we didn't know whether that was going to really gain us anything in terms of catalyst or motivating factor. So it's a little bit of a, yes, we're trying to use imperviousness as a way to motivate improvements in the system that they might not already otherwise, but we didn't want to get into a situation where we were going to be charging a very high rate and in fact perhaps even eliminating the option of some developers doing additional measures if they absolutely didn't have to. And when you get into a fee structure that's, more than 10 grand permit fee structure, that's painful for the developers.
Is there a reason you didn't choose to cap it for developers who employ green techniques instead of just for everybody?
Well, I guess in some ways we're expecting all of them to use some measure of green techniques, so we didn't want to make it a black or white or either or kind of situation. And in fact, the way the laws are evolving today, you really have to use
it's
some
covered in other
impervious.
arenas, essentially.
And Am I reading this correctly, that we're the only one who, if we make this change, would be employing a maximum?
Well, in one way, Montgomery County basically has the one fee structure, so you basically know, no matter what you're going to be paying. So they've got that both for concept
Okay,
fee
so
and permit fee.
Montgomery County is capped out.
They're capped in their own way. They have added that, what they call engineering design. It's a little bit hard and a little bit squishy to get your hands around, but basically if you had an engineer design your stormwater system, then they're going to tack on another .062 cents per square foot of disturbed area. So I think it was the way the county was trying to pull in a little bit more. But yes, neither Gaithersburg nor Rockville have a cap.
Any other questions?
Thank you for doing this work. Having been through this process, I appreciate the incremental additional charges based on impervious surface. I think that's the way to go. And I also appreciate the idea that you have a back and forth at the beginning to come up with the appropriate solution and keeping green things in mind. And like Councilmember Clay, it seems like it would be good to structure a fee so that the greener you were, the less you paid. But I don't see how to do that beyond a fee per impervious surface. So, thank you.
One clarifying question. So if you're developing something in Tacoma Park, you pay the Tacoma Park fee. Do you also pay that full Montgomery County fee, or do you get
That's
a break
my
for the fact
understanding.
that we're doing the stormwater and you're only doing this?
That's my understanding. We've had, the city engineers had several conversations with the county as we were reviewing this, and there's nowhere in the county ordinance nor in any of the information that they set out that they say, and if you have your stormwater permit from somebody else, then we'll just charge you for the sediment erosion. They have in their code these numbers charted out. They don't split them up at all. They combine the two functions with one fee structure. So it's my understanding that you have to pay in Tacoma Park and you have to pay in Montgomery County.
It's a double taxation thing, and in the end, the permits and fees are brutal for especially a small developer. And the smaller you are, the more you pay. As a percentage of the cost of the entire development, which I found impressive. They don't provide stormwater oversight. They leave that to Tacoma Park because we have that responsibility. But they're very happy to take your money in the manner of a fee.
They get a freebie.
We get a rebate on that?
Can we get on what
The
they
developer
charge?
doesn't get a rebate, I'll tell you that.
No.
Sounds like an issue for the
Tax duplication.
tax duplication
Now, my
task
understanding
force,
in-
even though I know they're trying to wrap up.
yeah. I believe in Gaithersburg and Rockville, they have more planning and zoning
They do.
powers than we do in Tacoma Park. So they're not in the same situation where you have to pay both Rockville and Montgomery County, or both Gaithersburg and Montgomery County. That's a fairly unique situation with Tacoma Park and Montgomery County.
So this is something that we could negotiate as a,
The only one who's in this situation?
yes.
Then the only other thought I had was, I like the idea of the cap in general, but just trying to think about all the possibilities that could occur in Tacoma Park, it seems unlikely that we would have a really large development parcel, except the possibility of some of the New Hampshire Avenue redevelopment. So I wonder, could we possibly get stuck in a situation where we've passed this for probably what's going to be 99% of development projects, but if there's some big parcels over there that get combined together, and projects get done, which I think ultimately we'd really like to have done over on New Hampshire Avenue, would we end up in a situation where we're really not even charging close to what the fee would be that would be appropriate? So that would be
Yeah,
a concern.
I guess that potential exists. One of the things that we can do if we maintain the structure is it allows for amendments to the codes and the fees in a fairly simple manner if we continue to track what the other jurisdictions are charging as well as what kind of applications we're getting in. Then potentially if we decide our maximum has now no longer represents a reasonable rate, we can adjust that.
Or the other possibility would be to put in 2 tiers under the commercial industrial institution, where you could do for parcels over a certain size, you could have a different structure and would hopefully end up being manageable for both small and large developers.
Any other questions? So this will come back to us.
Yeah, this is just a work session discussion that requires 2 reading ordinance to change the code. So in particular, if you were interested in us exploring the ideas Councilmember Wright has laid out, we want to get some guidance in that line so that we could bring to you at first reading something that reflected something different than we have here.
If I might, one of the issues that comes up is the balance between trying to attract certain development and, the whole green tape type of thing where we're trying to help out versus, I think is a very real fear is that there could be just a enormous project that requires a lot of staff time and whatever. And, I know we've discussed that. I don't know which way I would recommend, but certainly that's something we can talk as it comes before you.
I guess the only advantage to putting it in there is that those really large cases are going to be rare, and as part of a overall package to attract somebody, the council could always say, make an exception as a part of attracting a business here, like any other tax would be.
Okay. Thank you. And we'll move to our last item on the agenda, which is a discussion of proposed state legislation. Suzanne?
Thank you. Each year, the City Council identifies legislation for the upcoming General Assembly session. The bill deadline for the submission of the local requests, which are either Montgomery County or the bi-county Montgomery County, Prince George's County legislation, is September 17th. This is the deadline by which the bill definitely would get on their list for consideration within either Montgomery County or the bi-county committees. We've already submitted our legislative action request to the Maryland Municipal League for statewide legislation, again, encouraging enhancing municipal resources. And as you know, in about a month or so, we'll have the Maryland Municipal League Legislative Conference coming, the 3rd week of October. And that's a time when decisions are made for the recommendations for the Maryland Municipal League's legislative program. I wanted to, I haven't put out a general request for ideas for this session. I'm very open to them, but I realized I hadn't kind of sent out the email that said if there's an item that's important to you, to let me know. One of the things, though, that had come to me was from Sarah Daines, Director of Housing and Community Development, about legislation to help renters who are facing a building that's being foreclosed on, where the property owner isn't paying the utility bills for whatever reason. And this is, she found some legislation in Minnesota that has passed, and I have a copy of that, where currently, if you are a renter in a building and the landlord stops paying the utility bills, they can close down the building, the tenants have to face eviction, but the tenants cannot pay the utility bill to stay in the building. It's precluded. And so this would be legislation that would permit them to be able to pay the utility bill and at least have that item arranged. It seemed like a pretty good legislation. It seemed consistent with some of the things we've discussed in the past about protecting tenants' rights and the concern about foreclosed properties. So I thought that that would be one of the items that I'd bring to you tonight. We've traditionally had a number of environmental issues. They may come back up this year, but I wanted to kind of alert you to the very serious financial situation that the state of Maryland is going to be facing this year. We received there was a statement out by legislative staff that predicts about a $1 billion deficit in the Maryland state government this coming year. And this was on the heels of several rounds of budget cutting by the state legislature. I think they're going to have a really rough time in this coming session, and all eyes are going to be on on how to save money. And I would think that many of our efforts will be on protecting our resources at the municipal level, and that really would probably be a place where our lobbying efforts would be needed the most. I'm open to your suggestions about individual legislation, but I do see that as a fairly serious time consideration. I'd also like to mention that we are trying to retain some lobbying assistance. We have requests for proposals out. The proposals are due September 18th. I know of several good candidates that I think are going to submit something, and I look forward to seeing those and sharing that information with you to find a partner for us in this coming session.
I have a question on your proposal about the potential for enabling tenants to pay for the utilities. Mm-hmm. It's linked here, well, I guess it isn't. So go into foreclosure or otherwise do not pay. So we would be saying, no matter what the circumstance.
Right, basically, I mean, it can be a situation where the landlord isn't necessarily facing foreclosure, but otherwise is in a hardship situation or has decided not to pay the utility bill.
Right,
and it would allow the tenant.
I'm aware of at least one situation that came to my attention a few months ago where the building owner was not paying the utilities, and I think that same building has had the utilities turned off in the past.
And we've assisted in a number of cases getting utilities turned back on.
Right.
And a lot of work.
And what would be involved here would be the tenants somehow banding together and through some mechanism paying for the utilities for the whole building, because in many cases they're not individually metered units, therefore it would have to be the group doing it. It couldn't just be somebody saying, I want to pay my portion of it.
Right.
And it's not tied to any trying to come up with any specifics about how it might work. It's left to we would envision leaving it to the tenants to use the enabling legislation to come up with their own solution.
The language from the Minnesota bill I can share with people. I think it's fairly liberal in that it says that a tenant or a group of tenants can arrange to have the utility service continued or reconnected. It also allows for posting of information on how to get legal assistance and a variety of other things. So it's somewhat helpful, I think. I would want to provide this to the bill drafter, but it seemed to me a fairly flexible and common sense approach to the problem.
And the logistics of local bill versus a statewide bill, the local bill, we would get one of our legislators to introduce it, and it would go through a different process than a statewide bill because there's local courtesy on a local bill, but I could see this being a statewide issue.
And I think that may be something that we would want to talk with our local legislators about, which they would prefer.
Well, first of all, just in terms of clarification, you said that you're open to suggestions about the legislative agenda. I mean, my assumption is that the legislative agenda belongs to the council.
Absolutely. In terms of what you would like to see going forward, I didn't mean to give a misinterpretation of that.
Okay. I haven't seen it's Minnesota? I haven't seen the Minnesota legislation, but, my inclination for a fix for this, given the nature of the rental community and the income levels of the people in the rental community in Tacoma Park, is probably not to say we're going to set up a system where the tenants can pay their own rent, because that might work for, a few of our folks and our maybe some of our single-family folks, but those to me aren't the people who are going to be at most jeopardy of having the issue with foreclosure. And my recommendation would be to set it up so that the city can pay the utilities and lien the building. Doesn't the city get first rights on? You can't transfer a building until you pay all the taxes and liens due to the city or the state. Isn't that correct? Yes. So I think that's what I would do. That's the solution I would go with. I think if we really think we're going to have an impact on whether or not people get to stay in the foreclosed buildings, I think we need to be more aggressive than that, given the dynamics of this community. So that's my suggestion there. And three things. I would like to revisit that's the one I put forth last year. The Just Cause. I would like to revisit Just Cause eviction, do a better job of it, and enlist everybody in actually doing some marketing around it with our other county and city council folks. And I'd go to some of the faith and community-based leadership in the county. I don't know how much we can we pay to lobby for things that we're interested in at the state level? We did like we did mailings around the DC thing, didn't we? I mean, I think it would be worthwhile to get our message out in our terms instead of this thing that happened last year where they decided it was some get around so that we could get rent control for everybody.
Right.
And if we need a poster child against that, you can always use me, because I'm the one who really wants this to happen, and you have to know that I would support that. I mean, I would like to do that and do maybe a more coordinated and aggressive approach on just cause eviction. Okay. And the other two things I think about are things that I think should be in our statewide agenda but aren't. And one of them is that, from my perspective, one of the ways that people get trapped in housing is that we get mortgage brokers and real estate agents who express to potential buyers a cost of a house that isn't really a true cost of a house. And that's happened in the past with the negative amortization loans and zero down and different things like that, or temporary assistance from the buyer for a couple years. But one of the other ways that happens in Maryland is that the way the tax structure is set up, when you buy a house, for the first portion of time that you're in it, if the person who owned the house before you has already paid the taxes, for the rest of the time that you're in it, you're under the old tax structure. And so when the mortgage broker puts together your loan, and when the real estate agent puts together the package of, if you have a 6% loan, this house costs $1,200, and then the first tax payment comes around and their tax rate went from $2,000 to $6,000, I think that we should look at what other states do, which is that the new tax rate starts at the moment that the person assumes the house, and it gets prorated for the rest of the time. And that provides a little bit of income to the state and the city. It's not a lot of money, but what it does is it forces the mortgage brokers and the real estate agents to evaluate that person's ability to be in that house based on what the true costs of the house are going to be. And they can't make advertisements based on what it costs, for example, for Bruce Williams to own his house versus, because you've owned your house for a long time, versus somebody who was to come in and purchase your house now and the difference in taxes because of what the benefit that you get out of the homestead tax credit. Does that make sense?
Right. There was that law passed last year that insists that you have to show the new tax rate. But I think you're also talking about a prorated amount.
Yeah, I would prorate.
But last year they were addressing that issue with the higher tax.
You have to show it, but you don't have to. I don't think they very aggressively show it.
I don't think
because
so.
I've read all the pieces that come out on new places are for sale, and they don't have to get qualified under the new rate. And the key is if you force it to, if you do the prorate, so they start paying the new rate immediately, they have to qualify under the new rate, which makes a difference. And then the other suggestion that I would make is that we look at the cost of tickets in the state. I mean, to me, tickets are
Like speeding tickets?
speeding tickets, smoking tickets. I mean, whatever they are. I got in the elevator there at someplace in Greenbelt, and there's a $25 ticket for smoking in the elevator. And I'm thinking there was a time when, for my dad, that would have just been, you know, the cost of having another cigarette. So I feel like the fine, a lot of the fines don't seem to be that much of a deterrent to people's behavior, and the folks who invest the money in having the policing service don't get any of the money. And so I would look at changing the fee structure, and so that any additional costs in tickets for speeding or you know, whatever, traffic tickets or other tickets, went to the entity that actually writes the tickets. And I think this could help city and county budgets across the state, because what's going to happen is the budget pinch comes along, is they're just going to pass it on to us, and we're going to have to figure out how to cope with it, and it's going to pinch a lot of the different things that we do. And you know, having our own police department is one of the more expensive things that we do, and a lot of residents say, hey, I want you to spend more time on traffic and ticketing, but it's hard to do that when that takes you away from the other kinds of activities that you do, and it's a huge income drain to you because you're writing all the tickets, but somebody else gets all the revenue from the tickets.
If I can just add there that this issue comes up with some regularity, and the standard answer from the state is that's why we give you a
highway user tax.
Payment, yeah, and police, there's like 2 different forms of police payments from the state, and they say that's what those payments are supposed to cover.
Of course,
So I
they've
think,
cut them this past year.
I know, but I think as much as that argument makes sense, it would be a very tough push to get anywhere with that one. What they throw back at you is they don't want everybody setting up speed traps.
But I do think that it is something that would be built into the whole municipal revenue and enhancements, those structure discussions. And I think that that's, you know, as we go through and look at that whole picture, the amount for different kinds of fees and that kind of thing would be part of that discussion. It's certainly, you're right, every single year we don't get anywhere with that one, but I think we're in a desperate situation at the state level where I think we can have some fairly significant discussions about structures. I don't know that this is the one, but it's certainly, I think everything's going to be on the table.
Yeah, you know, and I would argue back that the fee structure is such that for many people the fees are a little more than a nuisance. The cost of driving to work. It's a public safety issue, and some communities bear the brunt of the cut-through traffic, not just like neighborhood cut-through traffic, but you know, they're on these arterial routes that are underfunded by the state, and so those police departments bear a much greater burden, and those residents bear a much greater burden. And if there was a relationship between, you know, the person who writes the tickets gets some share of the ticket, you'd have at least you get some cause and effect there, and it would make rational sense that people who suffer the burden more get more money so that they can engage in more policing activities. And I don't buy the argument that places are going to set up speed traps, because there's still, even when you get money from the tickets, there's still a cost to allocating some FTE to set up speed traps.
I was just playing devil's advocate. I know that's the argument that comes back.
That's why I brought my chunk of vehicle in, because I feel like residents are just really, they're tired of it.
And I don't remember what it was, your first, it was about the
Just cause eviction.
No, it was about before that. The utility for the city making the payment. I was trying to think if there was if that would set up a landlord trying to game that and saying, well, if I have if I'm in a situation where it might not even be foreclosure, but it's something else and I need relief, I'm going to not pay the utility bill. I know that I can keep going because the city will be paying it. Yes, I'll have to deal with paying that off another day, but that's on down the road if I sell the property. Therefore, I can let the city use its money to pay the utility bills in the near term and push the costs back when they'll be less or on somebody else to pay.
Well, they would lose the money in the transfer, Lorraine. There's only so much time that you can let somebody go with a tax lien on the property that's unpaid. And on the other end, I would argue that if a landlord gamed the system that way, and the city put out the money, and we added some reasonable interest rate to the money.
There you go.
And it kept them from going into foreclosure because they gamed the system that way, everybody wins.
Yeah. Make sure you put an interest payment on the
Yeah,
amount.
it is reasonable. Everybody wins. You can't lose that way.
You certainly don't want people put out in the street just because they, in fact, have been trying to pay their utility bill.
Right.
It's a really crazy situation.
If I might, I think what I'd like to do is write a couple of these things up and get them back out to you. And I know that there's some issue about the city paying some of the utility bill. We've certainly helped in the past, but I know that there's some legal barriers as well. And so I just want to be clear about it and share that with you. In terms of items that others may have or on Colleen's list that should be prepared before the 17th, I'd want to work with you relatively expeditiously to make sure we have good language for it.
And then on the 17th, we would need to present these.
You know, we don't necessarily,
depending on what they are.
depending on what they are, this is something that needs to be sent from the city into the county office at the state and the county delegation office. And there's back and forth that comes after that point. The hearing dates are in November. Most of them are in December. So we have some time with that. But it's obviously it's always better to have it better at the beginning.
And this is different than the list that MML submits?
That's right. These would be the City of Tacoma Parks individuals' recommendations to our county delegation for the 17th.
Thank you, Councilmember Clay, for clarifying that. What the city staff would be open to in terms of policy.
I didn't mean to say that.
And also thanks for those interesting public policy perspectives, which I am supportive of all those things, or ideas, I should say. And my idea is actually one that you mentioned to me, and I'm stealing from you.
Excellent.
And I've already talked to Al Carr and Jimmy Raskin and Head of Missouri about this idea, which is to take state bond bill money, put it into a loan fund for people to make environmental improvements to their house, and then have those loans be paid through a special tax assessment as opposed to a traditional loan. So that does a couple of things. One, it gives people access to a low cost of capital to make improvements, but it also reduces the risk for the loan because it's then the special tax assessment. So even if the person goes under, the house gets foreclosed upon, it's still stuck with the house, and many of these improvements might take 10 years to pay back, and people are frequently only living in their house for 5 years now. So they have the incentive also knowing that they're only going to have to pay for the value of the improvement while they're living there. It seems like there's two legal issues we need to figure out. One is, in talking to Jamie, he was concerned about how can you structure it so the state bond bill money can actually be used for individuals to make improvements to their house. There's probably some adjustment to the law that's needed for that. And then we would need to clarify whether we have the authority to make the special assessment on the properties. They were all very interested in this, not as a local bill, but as something that could be statewide. And it was done in Berkeley, but just for solar panels, I think.
Yeah, California's done it a number of different ways. And the other interesting thing about it is when that person goes to sell their house is that there's now energy efficient mortgages. And so if the work is done so the house can be rated as an energy efficient house, when the next person comes to do their mortgage, they can actually get a credit on how much they can finance. It gives them a little bit more buying power because the utility costs will be less.
Thank you, Mayor. For several years, we worked with MML on electrical aggregation and looking for opt-out aggregation from the state, the ability to do opt-out aggregation. We were a little more successful each year, but have most recently dropped that from our list as MML has dropped it from their list. But I think if we had been successful when we first requested that and the city had actually gone with wind power instead of the current electric power that we get, the residents would not only be now contributing to a better environmental impact, but also would probably be saving money on electricity, given the rate increases we've seen. I would like to suggest that we ask the state for the ability for Tacoma Park to be a model community for testing the opt-out aggregation, and in that way making it just a local bill.
And if I can just make the observation that many of these good ideas will take some work on our part, and that work will involve, among other things, going down to Annapolis and testifying and putting in some time and effort and organizing and, maybe getting a panel together. It's going to take some work, and people will need to think about that as we decide what it is that we want to put forward and how much time we as a group or as individuals have to devote to this.
I will commit to work on whatever we choose.
Since I went down to Annapolis a lot last year, other people didn't have as much opportunity to avail themselves of that. And I'd be happy to share.
But you learned a lot up there, I'm sure.
Yes.
Had a good time doing it.
Just before we adjourned, I wanted to remind people if they had specific comments on the draft of the strategic plan / goals, to try and get those to me very soon, or call me up and have a brief phone conversation with me about what. So I kept that in for us to review for next Monday's meeting.
May I have a lengthy phone conversation?
If you really insist on it, yes.
Anything else? You've got what you need for coming back to us?
Yes, I'll be distributing the information.
Okay. Then we're adjourned.
Very good.